you go. What is he going to say?
He's an editor at a journal and they have a strategy of making topical site women.
Uh-huh.
That's awesome.
Good.
Get filming. Okay, so I need the mic. So Lorena, do you want to kick it off and open it up? Are you sure? I'm not so much of an introducer orator, but I'm happy to do so. How can I get this? Okay, here we go. Okay. Okay. Hey, I guess this is the last late afternoon session.
That's right. No, there's some other stuff, right? There's the session with Sage. I'm not sure what that counts as. Something different.
This is the late afternoon seminar. So,
good.
So this is the last.
Yeah.
Okay. I look to Lorena. Lorena's in charge. Should we start? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the late afternoon seminar. I believe this is the last late afternoon seminar. There are still other things going on, so don't think that this is the last thing that you have to show up to. And we're very happy to have such a good audience that actually looks fairly gender balanced, which is nice to see. And this late afternoon seminar is on gender and methods, recent research on gender bias in political science, a review of the evidence and a discussion of its implications. So we have a gender balanced panel that will be discussing some of the recent publications. And I'm going to just start out with a few comments, and everyone's going to make comments for about 15 minutes each. And then we're going to open it up to questions, comments, answers. One of the things that has become more and more concerning to the American Political Science Association in particular, but I'm assuming that other political science associations are concerned about this too, is something that's called the Leaky Pipeline. And what this refers to is how women move through the graduate training and promotion, hiring and promotion process. And if you imagine a pipeline, like a tube, and water at different points in the tube, in the process of the water moving through the tube, you have people exiting. You have water exiting, i.e. women exiting the pipeline from selection into graduate programs, training, hiring, and then all through the promotion process. And in the American Political Science Association, as well as a lot of individual scholars on their own with research grants in combination, are trying to understand the reasons for this leaky pipeline. What they are intending to do is move beyond a focus on just collecting anecdotal evidence of bias and using this as to demonstrate that bias exists. What they're trying to do is collect and examine points on the pipeline and gather evidence for gender bias that's much more systematically gathered. One thing that they're really trying to do is they're trying to develop testable expectations about how the pipeline should look at all points along the pipeline if there were no gender bias, and then collect data to see whether or not that testable expectation is true, that null hypothesis is true. And the alternative hypothesis, for those of you who took my research design class, would be that there is some kind of gender bias. So some of the examples of things that people have looked at and continue to look at are selection into programs, the criteria, the gender balance, selection into different fields and the choice of methods, so the difference between American politics, who goes there, who studies that, political theory, political economy, comparative politics, methods, so the survival of students in the program when they drop out, who drops out, whether there's any kind of imbalance in that process, hiring processes, whether there's some kind of gender bias in how hiring takes place and who ends up getting hired and who ends up taking jobs. In terms of promotion, for those of you who are still graduate students, refers to once you're hired, how it is you become, move from an assistant professor to an associate professor, from an associate professor to a full professor. Some of the things that are taken into consideration are publications, and people have looked at total publications and whether there's any kind of gender imbalance in total publications, whether different genders, men or women, tend to send and publish their research in different kinds of political science journals, as well as not just different types of journals, but in terms of quality as well, and the types of things that they tend to publish on. They look at things like service. How much service are people asked to do, and how much service do people end up doing? So what do I mean when I talk about service? What I mean is how many hours you devote to doing things for your department, for your university, administrative tasks, serving on committees. And they also have started to look at the quality of those committees, how prestigious they are. And they have certainly found gender imbalances in not just the number of committees that people might serve on between men and women, but they've also found some imbalances in terms of the prestige of the types of committees. They look at teaching. For example, teaching loads, teaching hours devoted to students, and advising hours evaluations, whether or not there's any sort of imbalance in how professors are evaluated, depending upon whether they're men and women. They also look at citations. Citations being how often men versus women are cited. Their research is cited in other published, in their published articles, books, reports. They look at issues that have to do with networking. Networking is very important to getting your research known and cited, so they look at issues like networking, who are the nodes of networks. Do they tend to be women or men mostly? They look at invitations, panel balances. You've heard the famous word, nomiker, a manel for all male panels. Now, their goal is to use observational data, surveys, interviews, and experiments in order to create these data and in order to examine them. And some people who are studying gender imbalance, they use quantitative methods, but there are also a lot of qualitative methods being used as well. And their goal is not causal inference necessarily, because we're at the very beginning stages of just even documenting this bias exists, where it exists, whether it exists, how much it exists, does it exist over time, has it gotten better, has it gotten worse. So they're doing a lot of what I would call descriptive inference at this stage. And some of the papers that we have they been loaded up on the website? Some of the papers do address issues of causality, but most of them are descriptive, because we're just trying to understand where the bias is so that we can know if we need to actually make an argument that's causal about it. So let me give you two examples, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues here, of the kinds of things that people do study. And I reiterate that the goal of this research is not to gather information and data on anecdotal evidence documenting bias. The goal is to demonstrate that there's bias in a systematic way if there is bias, or demonstrate that there isn't bias in a systematic way if there isn't bias. So some people have studied, for example, syllabi. And I'm a big believer that syllabi are very important. And I made this argument even before I read the paper that we have here. It's not been published yet. It's a very early version of a research paper that I assume will be published as an article fairly soon. And one of the things that I've long thought about, and that these authors note, is that syllabi send very strong signals. They train graduate students and they socialize them. They create rules for graduate behavior. They create guidelines for what are considered essential readings and how to do them. They create norms on quality scholarship. What is quality scholarship? So they signal to students, and students carry this with them through the rest of their lives. They signal who matters and who doesn't in the profession, in the field, in the subject matter. So syllabi are very, very important. They shape fundamentally how people are trained, and not just that, but what they carry through with them when they become professors, and what they then teach as important to their students. So at CIDE, for example, at CIDE in Mexico, I advocated that we try to at least have people go through their syllabi and consider gender balance. And Well, I brought that up, and it was not well received. I'm not going to talk about that, though. So, and there is some evidence. Now, let me just tell you from a research design perspective what we don't want to do. So one strategy could be just to go around and find all the syllabi that has, for example, no women on it, and to keep collecting them over and over, and you come up with 20, 50, maybe even 100 across all the syllabi in the world that have very, very low female very few women authors, to show, and then you use this to say, aha, this demonstrates that there's bias. Okay, look at these people. Well, that doesn't actually demonstrate that the bias is systematic. All that shows is those people are potentially biased, but there might actually be some reasons behind the reason that those syllabi were constructed that way. But it only shows that those people are biased, but it doesn't say anything at all about whether everybody teaching courses are biased. So a better strategy, the correct strategy, would be to collect data on the universe of cases to which I wouldn't say your argument, but your description is meant to imply, and that which would mean all syllabi. So you could potentially collect all syllabi in an ideal world and then see how many men, how many women authors are included on them. Now, what the scholars have done, that seems like an impossible task, and I believe that it is an impossible task, but ideally that's what we would be able to do. But what two of the papers have done that are in the reading list that we put up on the IPSA-USP website, they have collected syllabi in, for example, the field of international relations. And so they went around and they collected syllabi they had a selection criteria for which courses they selected in, from which universities, from which professors, and that was very well outlined. And they collected syllabi, and they had 3,000 readings on these syllabi. And what they found was that 82% of these readings were actually by men. 18% had a female author, but it could have been female-male. Okay, so they did find this, and so I reiterate what they did was they collected they had a selection criteria that was very carefully thought out, and they collected IR syllabi, not thinking about who taught the course or anything like that. They just collected these syllabi, and then they took a look at them. So it's a very different research strategy, and when you show that across all IR syllabi from, say, the top 25 institutions in international relations, if you collect all their syllabi and then show that 82% of those syllabi were men or all male teams, whereas only 18% had a female solo or a female co-author, then that definitely is some evidence that there is gender bias, and it's not just these particular cases that could be explained away. In another paper, in a 2017 paper that I referred to earlier, they went to the top PhD programs. They collected over 500 syllabi from top PhD programs across field, IR, comparative, American politics, methods, etc., political theory as well. And I'm sure I'm forgetting one of the fields. And they had 42,588 readings. And you know what they found out with that much bigger sample? They found that 81% were male authors or teams, and they found that 19% have female authors. And so that's some pretty convincing evidence, and that's just descriptive evidence. Descriptive evidence. That's some pretty convincing evidence that there's some kind of an imbalance. Now, they also ran some models to code for the type of university you're at and a whole bunch of other things, how long the article had been published, et cetera, et cetera. So they had a lot of covariates in there to control for some of these other things that might be having an impact on how many male articles that would be on a syllabus versus how many female co-author or solo-authored articles that might be on a syllabus, and they still found that this held. The other thing that they found out is that if you look at who the professor was for the courses, that female faculty, especially full professor female faculty, they had a tendency to assign more female authors than other people. Okay, so that's some examples of what you can do from a research perspective to look into whether or not there is some bias in some kind of area. And I gave you an example of what you could be called using observational data, because this is data not gathered in a survey, not gathered in an experiment. They gathered the actual syllabi and then coded them. There's another example. There are other examples across all parts of the Leaky Pipeline. There are other examples, for example, for citations, and people that went through and looked at the top political science journals, coded the citations, and did the same kind of thing to show who cited more, who cited less, and they found that women were, of course, cited a bit less than men were. So you can see, and the point of what I'm trying to say here is that although you might think of gender bias as something that's normative and something you might feel very passionate about, something that might get you very excited, that in order to convince people that something like this exists in the world, in order to take what your impression is and actually parlay that into something that's actually convincing, there are really good research strategies, and they're precisely the research strategies that we're teaching here at the summer school that you can deploy in order to make your case. And you might be surprised to find that there is gender bias, or you might be surprised to find that in some cases there's not gender bias. But there are ways that you can go ahead and examine this in a scientific manner. Pass to you.
Thank you. So in reading through this research, I find that there's a lot of interesting material, and a lot of the material that we've posted on the site connects in interesting ways to what I'd call more sort of outward-oriented social science. I mean, this is kind of meta-political science, where we're studying the politics of ourselves, and that's interesting and valuable. A lot of the patterns, though, connect with the fact that all of us live in a very sexist environment and situation. And part of political science that is underappreciated, undercited, and under-rewarded is the study of how sexism operates in the political world in general to construct difference between men and women in politics and in everyday life. There's a lot of good research about Hillary Clinton's various presidential runs, for example. I'm not going to say, you can like her or dislike her. That's fine. But if, as we find in a lot of research, I have on my screen an article by Diana Carlin and Kelly Winfrey from Communication Studies that shows that Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin were discussed far more often in terms of their appearance, their clothes, their children, than any of the men involved in the 2008 presidential campaign. The same thing happened again in 2016 in the United States. And this is something that we see in comparative politics as well. When women run for office, they are simply discussed differently than when men run for office. There's evidence that women tend to win elections about as often as men, but the most recent evidence is that that's because women only run for office if they think they're much better than the men they're running against. They have better qualifications, better degrees, better alliance networks, and more fundraising on average in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe than the men they run against. And in spite of all of those advantages, they only on average come in even with the men. So the political world in which we live and operate is a world that contains a number of biases, ideational and structural, against women and against the full participation and incorporation of women. Our world inside academia is part of and continuous with that broader political world. There are things we can and should do as scholars that address both the outside and inside biases and the way they interconnect with each other. We should ask ourselves, when we design syllabi, whether we've considered issues of sex and gender and how they play in the subject matter that we're teaching. When we teach an introduction to comparative politics, do we have a session or two on the politics of gender and women's representation worldwide? If we don't, why not? This is a large, impressive literature in comparative politics, and it should surely be featured. This is an opportunity for us to speak to the culture and system that generates unequal outcomes both in politics and in academia. I think these sorts of engagement should also play out in how we choose and consider our research topics. I'm not saying drop what you're doing and study gender. I am saying ask what gender has to do with what you're studying. there's almost never nothing, right? And if you've decided that it's simply not interesting to you, that's a decision worth sitting with for a while. In saying this, I should speak especially to the men in the audience, since women have a well-known tendency to write more about gender than men, not because it's, prejudice or bias or something, but simply because men don't recognize this as important as it is. We should pick up the slack on this, and that's a question we should always ask ourselves. What can I do to take gender into account? In doing these things, we are doing what we as scholars can reasonably do to shape the broader system that generates sexist outcomes. That said, there are things that are very specific to our discipline and even our subfield that deserve attention. In one of the articles posted on the website by Seamus and Wise, I believe, or something, there's a table, figure 2, that's worth looking at that comes from the APSA data, which shows that of all the subfields of methodology, methods is by a very narrow margin, I might know, but still nonetheless, the most male. Of all the subfields, methods has done the worst job incorporating women as researchers, publishers, and instructors. That's an interesting thing to interrogate. One might simply say, well, this is also true in computer science and math and other fields, and maybe there are big problems in education in elementary school about. Here's the truth. You don't need to be amazing at math to be a good methods instructor or researcher. Most people in the Society for Political Methodology don't know measure theory. They probably couldn't do a complicated integral. This isn't what methodology mostly is. Methodology mostly is asking fairly simple questions about research tools and finding an interesting way to answer them. And that's quantitative and qualitative methodology. There is nothing deeply sort of high math where you're going to run into all kinds of gender stereotypes about what I just described. This is not, quantum physics where all kinds of stereotype thread and other things come into play. We are just a lot simpler than that. So we have to ask a question about why this pattern persists if it's not part of what is, in fact, a broader issue in very high-tech and high-math fields. I think there are two things that the articles point us to that I think are highly relevant. As the Barnes and Boulot article point out, there's extensive evidence that women in graduate school and undergrad, but graduate school is more interesting right now, don't get mentored as well as men. Men in particular, but women also, are more likely to accept mentorship requests, and this is experimental evidence, that comes from a person with an identifiably male name than from an equivalent person with an identifiably female name. It also is the case that women do not get opportunities to co-author as often as men. There's significant evidence that across political science, the rate of co-authoring among men has increased substantially. The rate of co-authoring that includes women has not increased nearly as much, let alone sort of entirely female teams. This, I think, is particularly relevant in methodology because in methodology, we don't really teach you in classrooms how to do the research. We teach you how to use tools. We do not teach you how to ask new questions, answer them, and write articles. That knowledge comes from mentorship and co-authorship, which are domains where, as we know, there is bias. Okay, so there are things we can do to address this. We don't have to fix sexism in the whole world, right, to make progress on this. One thing we can do, and this is something that I wish there were a lot more male methodologists in the room so that I could say it to them, is we, as male methodologists, should make sure to try to mentor female potential methodologists. This is crucial. Women who are in methods should also do this because the evidence shows that they don't do it as much either. But men in particular, we should make that effort to reach out. That is clearly one of the reasons why methodology is 75% or so male, is that we aren't doing a good enough job mentoring promising potential methodologists who are female. Nobody, almost, starts grad school saying, I'm going to be a methodologist. Nearly all men who end up as methodologists get there because somewhere along the way someone said, why don't you try this? If no one ever says that to a woman, then that's where we get to how we are now, right? Men can also make an effort to reach out in terms of co-authorship, and I think these are good ideas. These are things that are, we need about 100 men in the world to do a good job of this, and things will change, right? That's worth pursuing. A second line of sort of policy change on this that I think would be very helpful is for us to simply incorporate more material about how to develop and answer methods questions into our methods classes. If we taught how to identify a good methods question, how to do Monte Carlo simulation, how to set up a methodological experiment, if these things were normal parts of our curriculum, then women who might not get the mentorship relationship because of gender bias still are exposed to the often not terribly complicated tools necessary to make a contribution in methodology. And I think this is another change that institutionally would be quite cheap and frankly intellectually attractive. So I see no reason whatsoever why we shouldn't address these simple points. Some other agendas are in place in methodology that I think are highly promising. The Visions in Methodology program that the National Science Foundation has funded, bringing together junior and senior women in methodology in the United States, is demonstrably effective. There's a good program review that shows that it has in fact increased research and publication in methodology. And this is a very positive agenda. We can ask our departments to be attentive to the possibility that women might make good methodologists when we're hiring. That's completely reasonable. These are all good things to do. But I think as scholars, some of these simple day-to-day changes in our behavior and curriculum are the most obvious ways forward. If you see someone who's smart and interested in methods, and she hasn't asked a methods research question, you should bug her about that, right? You should ask her if there's something you can do to help. You should say, what are you interested in? Let's have a conversation. Let's have a coffee and talk about your methods research agenda. And she says, I don't have one, and you say, why, right? This is what we do with men. We just don't notice it. And if we start doing it with women self-consciously, that can only help. So in my opinion, these are a couple of different ways that we can address both the macro issues in the broader society that impact us and the specific issues that affect us as methodologists. And I think we have every ethical obligation to do this, but also every intellectual obligation. There's just no reason not to bring as many voices into these conversations as possible. It's not like we have a giant surplus of methodologists. So let's do it.
Okay. I'm going to stand because I like to stand. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about this leaky pipeline and some of the things that we know. I'm going to speak about a particular context, the Scandinavian. I have some colleagues who actually do research on this question, but also some of the methodological challenges, because in the readings that were submitted for today and in also the stuff that my colleagues are doing, I would say there's nothing really that would enable us to actually make a causal inference as far as this actually works. And I'll come back to this. So this is just an example of the leaky pipeline. If you look, so Aarhus University, that's my university, we do quite well at the postdoc level. 43%, of course, this is probably more humanities, well, I know, more humanities, female candidates, whereas in some of the harder sciences, fewer. But in general, it's not bad. But of course, when we go then to the, associate, so tenure, and then full professor, it gets really bad. And we actually underperform in relation to, Denmark in general underperforms in relation to the EU average. And I have some colleagues that have used Aarhus University as an in-depth case study. And they did a pretty rigorous design as far as a combination, lots of interviews, surveys, So workplace surveys, interviews with heads of department, interviews with female candidates, et cetera, et cetera. And what they were finding were they were hearing about three things, or three, I would say almost processes, that could matter, which could suggest potential interventions. So the one was, if we take this one over here, there's all sorts of things about academia that is, you could say, mobilizing masculinities. These are networking, these are gatekeepers, these are all sorts of different things that are going on between men where women simply, for some reason, are excluded. And there are certain interventions, perhaps, you could go in to break some of this. There is then, trying to read it myself, things like work-life tensions, which is actually an interesting problem in a country like Denmark where we have 1 year paid paternal leave. That still can be a problem. And actually, in some respect, it's actually even, some respect, is actually worse because we have it. I'll come back to that. But of course, there's also things like young female researchers are expected to go abroad internationally for 6 months or a year. Can they get their husband with them? Whereas it's typically assumed in the other way around that the wife will go with the husband. And then gender stereotypes, et cetera, that lead to hiring practices where female candidates are not seen as competent as the male candidate, et cetera. So we have a lot of, say, comparative work suggesting that there are some differences. And I'll show you in a second some of the comparative work across Scandinavia, because there's actually huge differences. One of the things that a difference both across Scandinavia that might work is things like mentoring, coaching. Jason was talking about some of this career development. Things like institutional procedures promoting gender equality. Things like having women on appointment committees. Sometimes that actually helps because we tend to think that people that look a lot like us and are like us are probably more competent than other people, unfortunately. Positive discrimination, which of course also raises some challenges. But on all Scandinavian countries, we do have specific positions that are set aside as you have to hire a female if you want this professor money, for example. Or there's research funding that's only available for female candidates. Visibility procedures, that's one of the things in particular it looks like it works in Norway, is simply forcing yourself all the time to say, okay, we only have this many women. Maybe we can do better, because that then makes a norm going through the institution, developing that we have to be aware of these types of things. Family friend or non-gender policies, one of the things that we know differences between Scandinavian countries. In Denmark, we have a year paternity leave. Parental leave. But it's typically 10 months. Women will take that for 10 months, and then the husband will take it for 2 months. So just something like that, we would say you're putting female candidates at a disadvantage. Whereas in Sweden, for example, they have 2 years. And the husband will typically take the second year, and the wife will typically take the first year. And it's actually really cool. For the wife, for example, okay, she's taken a year break from her work, then she can go back and kick, because her husband's doing all the changing diapers and making food and stuff, so she can concentrate on her career. Whereas in Denmark, you know, if you're only gone for 2 months, if I'm only doing that for 2 months, she's not able to really concentrate. If we look then at some of these differences across Scandinavian countries, and I hate to say this as, oh, I'm an American citizen, but I'm actually applying for Danish citizenship. So I feel we're not doing very well. If you look at the Leaky Pipeline in Aarhus, again, at PhD level, it actually looks really good. A postdoc, pretty good, etc., down. Copenhagen, they hire more PhDs, but they also have a leaky pipeline. But look in Oslo and Bergen in Norway. In particular, Oslo, it's only at the full professor, and even then, almost 30%. full professors are female. There's a huge difference between Aarhus with 15% and 27%. Uppsala and Lund in Sweden are not doing quite as well. And so my colleague that's done this research has then looked at the different, you don't read all the stuff on the table, it's just showing you Denmark doesn't do very much, actually. You'd be surprised at how little we actually do on gender promotion and gender equality. Whereas Sweden is kind of an intermediate case, and then Norway is kind of the full panoply. But of course the problem, and here's where I get into the methods. What do we actually know? So, for example, this type of research is all comparative. And comparisons in this kind of context, we don't know what is actually causing the difference, because there's a plethora of differences between Denmark and Norway that are not included in this design. It's not everything else. It's not a most similar systems design. There's huge societal differences. So this is descriptive research. And then the question is, well, how do we do it? How do we make it causal? Well, there's two ways we can do it. An experiment. An experiment would be really cool, but how many of you would volunteer to be in the control group? I don't think, and ethically, you can't do an actual experiment. Natural experiments, of course, we get into the challenge of, is everything else equal? And even if we take Aarhus and Copenhagen, there are differences. Just as an example, Copenhagen is simply a different work environment as far as job market. It's much easier for the husband, for example, to get another job, or there's all sorts of different differences other than just, for example, a policy intervention, a gender equality policy. So I'm skeptical about the comparisons. So what do? Well, we do within-case analysis. Which is, of course, though, asking a different question. And this is also some of the problems. It's asking, how does it work? When it works. So we would go to Norway. We would go to Oslo and try and trace back. Go back in time in that respect, figuring out, okay, you introduced this intervention at this given time. Okay, we think that it actually promoted gender equality. What is the process? How did we get from your intervention to actual, something that looks like a demonstrable success? Is there a process? And if so, how did it work in that case? So that would be learning how it works. And this is what I would say we do a lot in evaluation research, case study methods in evaluation research. We either use something like process tracing. They have other names for these types of methods. They call them contribution analysis, for example, different theories of change. But the logic is the same, is that we want to investigate, in this respect, a successful case in a case where it actually worked. So how did it actually work in a case? What are the fingerprints, the evidence that it produced, or did not maybe, produce the given outcome? The problem, and this is, of course, the huge downside of this kind of research, is there's something called mechanistic heterogeneity. Basically, processes and mechanisms, you can't just take it out, okay, it worked really well in Oslo, let's move it somewhere else, the same policy. You need to tailor fit your policy to the context. You can't just take it out, because, for example, in Norway, there's all sorts of other things going on that enable certain interventions to actually have an impact, broader societal trends regarding gender equality. So if you think that you can just take your intervention, okay, it worked in Norway, in that context where it's a society-wide press for pushing gender equality, take that out of the Norwegian and move it to Denmark, where you do not have the same type of societal pressure for gender equality, it's not going to work. Or it's not going to work in the same, or it actually might produce some quite unwanted effects. What this, though, suggests is that I think we just simply need to do a lot more focused research. And I hope my colleague will start maybe thinking of doing a little bit more type of tracing how it works, which is what they do in evaluation research. They also do RCTs, experiments. Again, it's difficult to envision an experiment in this kind of situation. And then try and slowly figure out what works in particular context and expand outwards from there. And only then, I think, will we actually be able to really figure out how these things, how our interventions, how we actually can intervene in the world to promote gender equality. Because ideally, and I'm speaking now as I run a method school in Europe, the ECPR method school. I would love to be gender blind. I would love just to be able to hire the best candidate, full stop. Unfortunately, there is lots of, especially quant. I simply can't find very many women that are at that level that can do excellent quant yet. But we're doing things like we're really active in TA recruitment, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of research we can do to really understand how these things work, what kind of interventions actually work, and what are the conditions under which they might actually work so that we can change the world. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's interesting because we think of Scandinavia as sort of the paragon of excellence and all kinds of things. So it's a little depressing to look at those numbers. So, a little bit better than one of the statistics I read in one of the papers. It said at Research One universities, there are 7.2% of full professors are women. So that's a pretty bad number. That was 2010, so maybe there's been this explosion since then, but I tend to doubt it. Okay, so I really am grateful for the opportunity to be here discussing this issue, in part because Allyson put together such an excellent group of readings that I was forced to, with pleasure, sit down and read. And it was really eye-opening because, frankly, some of us kind of knew in our guts this was going on, but that's not very convincing or compelling as a set of arguments, as Allyson has already said. So here we have some data. And as you know, if you've had a chance to look at these readings, they cover a variety of issues. They cover publication, disparities in citations, the training / inclusion of women on syllabi, networking, teaching, and teaching evaluations and service that might vary across along gender lines, and also questions related to hiring and promotion. So I just want to make a few observations based in part on some of these readings and in part on my own experiences on some of these issues. So on the first set of issues on disparity along gender lines and citations, I think there were quite a few studies here that documented this quite effectively, at least in descriptive terms. So we can now say, okay, there's something going on here quite systematically, and the data's out there, and now we have Google Scholar and all this kind of stuff. So it's relatively easy to engage in systematic research. But the next step is to kind of understand what's going on, what's behind this. And this is where a lot of these papers are sort of speculative, very informed speculative, but it strikes me that this is the frontier, the next frontier of research. So there's three kind of core mechanisms that I see in these research papers. One is gendered networks, which has already been raised. And this, of course, has implications for citations because, you might be more likely to cite your buddies. Not even consciously. It's not like you have a pact necessarily to increase your, H score or whatever. It just, happens subconsciously. But maybe there are pacts as well that might be going on as well. If not, let's talk. Let's start forming pacts. Okay, and then, so these networks happen along gender lines. Another thing is that women tend to cite themselves less, and there seems to be some evidence for this. And a third thing that popped up is that women don't even think to send their work in the first place to certain journals. And I have to say, if I can get a little bit introspective here, I was really depressed reading this because I was like, ooh, I think I'm doing all of this stuff subconsciously. First of all, I realized I have never submitted a paper to 3 of the top journals I just never even tried or never even thought. And that's ridiculous. Okay, so I'm going to go out and change that henceforth. And I'm happy to say that I don't see this happening as much among my female graduate students. They're getting socialized in a different environment. And of course, they're going to submit to the APSR and the AJPS and the JOP and whatnot. It's like, of course they're going to do that. So there's hope there. This may matter less for folks outside of American academia. but these are the kinds of issues that pop up in the U.S. Certainly, I think a lot of women, cite themselves less. And here again, it really struck a personal chord. I remember putting together the syllabus for the field seminar in comparative politics last year that I was co-teaching, and I just didn't even think to put myself in. I would never put myself on a syllabus. And I was hesitant to cite myself. Another thing that popped into my head that I don't believe was covered in these readings, but maybe might be relevant here, is social media usage and tweeting about your publications. So I've noticed more and more that people do this, and this is purely anecdotal, so someone needs to go out and do this study, scrape the web, and find out who's tweeting about their own research. My anecdotal impression, and I might be wearing biased gender glasses, is you tend to see men doing this more than women. I could be wrong. I think there's also generational effects going on here. But I don't tweet. I'm on Twitter because I follow other people, but I don't tweet. Frankly, partly, and this might be gender, because I don't have time. I have kids. I can barely, go to work, get my job done, and get food on the table and get enough sleep. So there is no time left for tweeting in my life, and maybe tweeting will happen later in life when they're in college. But so that might be gendered as well. But I think it's more than that. It just feels uncomfortable to me in my gut to sit there and tweet and say, I just published this article. So I wonder whether that's happening. And also here I am presuming that tweeting matters. So that's another study that has to happen. Does tweeting increase citations and so forth? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe I'm just assuming it does. But I would imagine it does, especially if you're increasing your followers and getting retweeted and whatnot. It's just a way to find out about research that you might not otherwise find out about. So I think that's another channel through which this might happen, I hypothesize. Okay, so another area is teaching evaluations. And here I want to cite one of the readings on this list that I thought was fascinating. So there's this paper by McNell et al., What's in a Name? Exposing Gender Bias in Student Ratings of Teaching. I referred to this obliquely and in passing in this morning's session in my course, but I think it's really worth a read because we have this sense that there is gender variation in course ratings, and there's some descriptive data that suggests this, but there's too many confounders. Is actually the quality of the teaching worse? Is it the content of the courses? We don't know. There's all kinds of things that could come into play to affect this. It may be that women tend to teach more service courses or, whatever it is that tend to get lower ratings. We just don't know. And to some degree, you can control for these in analyses, but there's still too many confounders. So this study is really interesting because this professor got IRB approval from his institution and agreement on the part of his teaching assistants to undertake this study in which it was, I think, an online course, or at least a component of it involved online teaching. And the instructors were not visible to the students and could not be identified except by their name. So he had two, or she, I think it was a man that was teaching the main course that had a male and a female teaching assistant. And each teaching assistant taught two sections, one under the name of a woman and one under the name of the man. And so they compared evaluations across these different groups. And basically, the punchline. Basically, the women, doesn't matter if it was really a man, got a lower evaluation than the man. And there's some hypotheses about why this is going on. They weren't testing sort of the mechanisms here. But one of it, the main sort of suggestion about what's going on is this notion that women are in a double bind. What does that mean? Women are expected to be nurturing and encouraging and supportive because that's our gender role, right? It's the mothering stereotype. But at the same time, that might make you look less professional and serious. You're not as hardcore. So, and if you are hardcore, you're not conforming to that expectation. So you get sort of stuck in the middle. So that's a hypothesis about what's going on. But I think the study is very interesting and worth looking at because it's a controlled experimental setup looking at these evaluations. So let me just say a couple of things about hiring and promotion. And so promotion issues, a lot of these studies, I think, see the biggest gap is in the jump from assistant to associate, so the tenure leap. certainly in American academia, it looks like elsewhere as well. And some of this seems to be because of lower tenure rates. Some of it is because women just step off the tenure line before they even get to that point. And I think, this is a really interesting issue to tackle, and there's some, I know last year I was the interim chair for the Standing Committee on Women at Harvard at my university, and we looked at some data on this. I don't know if I can actually reveal the data because some of it was confidential. Some of it might actually be posted on the Office of the Dean for Diversity at Harvard, and it's quite interesting. But, in general, there's studies of many universities that seem to find that to be a critical point, although it looks like the jump to full professor is an issue in Scandinavia. It seems like the jump to full is less of an issue in a lot of American institutions, if I understand the research well. And so this raises some question about what's going on, especially around leave policies and childcare policies. So some of these issues you just, Derek just touched on. Is it, and I think this last point that you made about context really matters is absolutely critical, because there's different social norms. So you're talking about how wonderful it is in Sweden, was it, where there's a year and a year? Okay, so I'm not sure it would work the same way in this particular historical moment in many U.S. institutions, because one of the biggest complaints that we get about parental leave policies is that women take them to actually breastfeed and raise children, and they have responsibilities that prevent them from doing work. And men sit in their office or in a cafe or in their home office and actually do a lot of work during the parental leave. Now, I'm not saying this is true for all men. I don't want to sound like the battle of the sexes here. That's not at all the case, but it's certainly the case in some instances. So it's a concern, and it's a very difficult issue to tackle in the cultural context of the U.S. because, there are some men that really genuinely need to engage in contributing to the household and changing diapers and are going to cut into their research time. So do you say men don't get parental leave for this, because you're all going to be off exploiting this and giving yourself a year advantage over your female colleagues, or actually more if you think about it, because the women are experiencing a lost year in essence. Lost from the perspective of work, not from the perspective of other things. So let's take a full life balanced picture here. So these are really tough issues. Child care policies, this is really interesting from the perspective of the research program in political science on welfare policy variation cross-nationally. Some countries are, known to be more friendly and supportive to women and have more gender-friendly welfare regimes than others. Of course, we always hold up Scandinavia as a paragon. This is, it fits into some of the research programs as well. Hiring. So this is an interesting question. And I recently chaired a search in my department for open field senior search. It's the first one we had in decades in my department. And we took gender seriously. Now, by law and also by ethical reasons, it's not like we were only going to look at female candidates or underrepresented minorities at all. But we wanted to make it a part of our practice in evaluating candidates to take seriously gender and to try to overcome implicit biases. So a lot of the papers have cited implicit biases as something that's driving promotion decisions or hiring decisions that are detrimental to women. And so a number of universities are instituting mandatory training in implicit biases, recognizing them, making us deal with them. There's a practice that the Office of the Dean for Diversity in my university recommended that I thought was quite interesting, and we effectively incorporated into our search process, which was start with your list. And this is a senior search, so generally speaking, you don't just look at applicants in senior searches, you also look around at the field. And so start with your dream list of women and underrepresented minorities first. Build that list and then merge in other candidates who are equal or superior to those candidates. I thought it was a really interesting strategy for approaching this question because it means that you are considering candidates from these categories from the get-go and not tacking it on afterwards as, oh, we should be considering this. And so I think that's one strategy to consider. So just to wrap up, I think there's a lot of interesting suggestions that come out of these papers. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done on mechanisms in order to come up with approaches that seem to be effective. But you know, there's one paper that talks about the Women Who Know Stuff website, and so that was established several years ago to create lists of women who have expertise in particular areas. And so one of the recommendations from that paper is put yourself on that list. And here again, I felt, oh, wow, you know, it's sort of struck a personal chord because I never put myself on that list. So now I'm thinking, oh, I better do that. Okay. And then, you know, the self-citation. So let's get over these, you know, weird shame that some people have. Maybe not entirely a gender among women, but it seems to be disproportionately concentrated in women. And, you know, cite yourself. Be proud of your research. Cite it. And you'll also see women often practicing things that I heard was going on in the Obama White House, recognizing each other when they make an argument or a claim and amplifying their voices. So that's another thing that can happen. Perhaps the social media strategy, if it proves to be consequential and effective. Service, none of us really touched on service. There were some of the articles focused on service, and you know, this to me is a double-edged sword. This is just one comment I want to make on service. So some of the articles say, you know, women tend to do a lot of service, and when they do service, it tends to be in lower profile settings. So they're not the chairs, they're not the heads of this, that, or the other thing, or they're on the less important committees. That may be true. Put them on the more important committees, give them the more high profile positions. I will say that there is a double-edged sword to this, and I know this firsthand, because, you know, that statistic of the 7.2% women in full professor positions really rings true for me in my university. There just really aren't that many senior women at Harvard. And so with the best of intentions, my university wants women to have leadership positions and to be chairs of committees. It's wonderful. The problem is if there's not that many women, it means we're being taxed quite a bit, doing a lot of service. Even if it's an important service, we're doing a lot of service because there's just a numbers game going on here. And I think also checking the syllabi is a really important thing as well. So there's a number of useful, potentially productive strategies also that have been highlighted around childcare issues that, of course, have to be contextually specific, and parental leave issues that have to be contextually specific. But things we can do that have been highlighted in the course of the panel and in the readings. Thank you.
Thank you. So two things have been highlighted here across all of us. One is that this is an open field for research and discovery. We don't really even have a good idea where biases are playing out. I mean, these articles do a lot, but there are still so many unanswered empirical questions just from a descriptive point of view. We also don't have much idea about causality, what's causing this, and this was also mentioned by Derek and Melani and Jason. The other thing that was mentioned in the panel were the different policy changes, practices that could be put into place, and this is from a more practical standpoint. The first is obviously from an academic research standpoint, that this is a very open issue that could be studied in master's theses, PhD theses as a real point of focus of study for your career. But the second thing are the policy changes. We don't really have a good idea about exactly what policies work, when they work, why they work, as was mentioned here. So those are the two big things that we focused on in the panel, and now we're going to open it up to questions, comments, and answers. But before I open it up to everyone, I had a very brief conversation with Patrick coming in, and he, as an editor at a journal, has some experience with a best practice, and it would be great for him to come and comment on that, because that's not something that we've really commented on here.
I don't know the best practice. We haven't done a study to know whether it's best practice or not, but certainly a practice. Cool, thanks. Whoa, I broke the place. Yeah, so one of the things we do at International Studies Quarterly is we're sort of operating on the hypothesis that a lot of gender bias in citation is simply because people aren't thinking about it. That there are implicit tendencies to cite one's colleagues, to cite people that one knows, and so on and so forth. And so these sort of citation circles, even if they don't rise to the level of, I would call them citation cartels.
Cartels.
They do exist. There are reasons why certain methodologies get foregrounded within certain parts of the profession, but that's a whole nother panel. So what we did is we sort of took as our basic operating presupposition that people just often don't notice this. Now, we as editors notice this when manuscripts come in. So we have adopted the practice for the last several years of, at the stage that an article has been accepted or provisionally accepted, we will then give the author a series of things they have to do for formatting changes and so on and so forth. And we also do quite a bit of fairly extensive sort of getting down in the weeds and helping the article become readable and so on. One of the important pieces of data that we always reflect back to authors at that stage is, oh, by the way, 80% of your citations are guys. You want to think about that. We can't really put, your piece will be rejected unless you fix this as a penalty behind this. But we encourage authors to reflect on that. And when we're giving our instructions to reviewers, we ask our reviewers to keep that in mind. So often we find that we don't even have to say it at the end because a reviewer has said it 2 rounds of review earlier. And in the process of the revise and resubmit, the authors have gone back and fixed that imbalance to some extent. So a little bit of just signaling, a little bit of foregrounding and highlighting, we have found, can often go a long way. It doesn't work in all cases, but it does seem to, as people start to recognize, oh yeah, I guess I was doing that. I didn't mean to. Let me fix that. We find that a number of things can be sort of fixed that way. So just a very simple little intervention. And in fact, if you're thinking of submitting something to International Studies Quarterly, you can start already. Know that we're going to ask you that at some point and sort of think, hey, before I send this in, maybe I should just take a look, do a quick count. Oh, goodness. Oops. Okay, let me fix that. Also, on the Women Who Also Know Stuff website, I was just browsing it a little bit, looking at actually some of my former students who are on the website. And one of the things that I now know that I need to email them about is don't just list yourself, but maintain. Because some of them got listed as when they were in the time since they've been listed, and now things have been published, but they don't have the little "I've published on this" star next to their entries. So you have to go and maintain the profile. So I now have several emails I need to send tonight to former students to say, hey, update your profile on womenalsoknowstuff.com.
All right, questions, comments, observations, ideas for future PhD theses? Yes. Can you stand up and say your name?
My name is Anna. I'm a grad student at the International Relations Institute. And first of all, thank you so much for bringing this topic to all of us, because I don't think we have this, the culture of studying gender in the political science department and in Leaky as well. I think we have started for some time now. We have gender studies groups in both departments, so I think that's the start. And I would just like to say 2 things. One, we have a website like that in Brazil. So, girls, I don't know the name, I think it's Mulheres Também Sabem, something like that. So if you want to be there, you can publish your profile. The other thing is, I agree with everything you said, and I've been looking into that for some time because I need to get into that in my, not necessarily on higher education, but on how pyramidal institutions tend to leave women behind at a certain point. And one thing that comes to mind that I think is interesting to think about is that none of these countries that you cited, and not even Brazil, are countries that you have public policies that prevent women from getting places. So not necessarily, you do not have institutions that are like saying, sorry, you're a woman, so you cannot get in. You have some countries that it is true, you have that, it's institutionalized, but here you do not, and none of the countries that you cited have this kind of policy, like a real policy against women. But at the same time, for example, in Brazil, during my research, I found out that women actually are more highly educated than men, and they white women tend to earn half of what men earn, and black women tend to earn a third. And that's in an average, right, scale throughout the country. So if you think about, like, there must be some, I don't know, we will have to do all the tracing that you guys talked about, but there must be some cultural aspect, like cultural constraints, social constraints that are not necessarily inside the institution, because the institution, of course, there are some measures that you can take that you talked about, and that we could try to talk about here as well, what we could do to try to make professors use syllabi where they put more women and things like that. But for example, there was this author that he was talking about political representation, and here in Brazil we have a quota system that now doesn't really work, but it's been in place since 1997, and it's still with 9% women. But what happened is when you think about political life, like we're talking about, political life is already very sexist. And in some things that men find comfort, for example, family. A family for a man in politics is support. And it's also good politics. And, oh, he's a family man, he has a family, and things like that. For women, especially minority women, because in the case of Brazil, I think it's important to take race into account when you talk about gender. Women find it more difficult when they have a family, because not always the family will be able to go with her to do political campaigning around the country. They will not be necessarily able to move to Brasilia, and they also do not have they don't know people as much people as they should know to be able to get involved in politics, and also they don't have as much funding as men. Only the women that are, for example, they come from political families, or they've been involved in politics for some reason before, and because of that they get involved and they get elected. But most of women, they don't even know how to participate. So I think that all these aspects is important to think about, because there are things that prevent women from public life in general before they enter an institution. So when you get, for example, parental leave in Brazil, men get only 5 days, and they're not even working days. It's 5 days. So if you your wife is on labor on a Wednesday, you'll be back to work on Monday. So if you do not, like, and I think that public policies, they tend to change the public before the public changes itself. So if you do not instruct, for example, companies that women and men should have a role to play in parenting, women will always be seen as, oh, they'll have to be for 6 months, so we'll spend money on people who won't be here. So once you have that balance, like in Sweden, for example, then companies tend to look always. Lose or lose, they are both going to have parental leave, so maybe you can consider to be equal. And another thing that could be done, for example, something that my friend in HR does, is when you look at curriculums for positions or for assisting jobs and things like that, you can, for example, take off all the names and just look at the curriculum and then decide, and then you find out at the end if it's a man or a woman, and that tends to work for them.
Jason, she mentioned some things that I think you can respond.
Okay, so I mean, I agree wholeheartedly that there are a bunch of issues related to sexism in academia and beyond that aren't closely tied to institutional policy. And this is something, I think, because we're political scientists, we like to look at things that have easy sort of institutional policy fixes. And there's a certain sense in which this literature is under behavioral. We need to get the sort of behavioral and political psychology people engaged with this as well. There are a lot of things that go just beyond, and we can have perfectly equitable and gender-friendly policies. And if the people inhabiting those institutions are still deeply sexist, things are going to go wrong. And that's absolutely the case. And I mean, I can tell you horror stories from my experience, you know, and everyone else in this room almost surely can. So when we're thinking about these changes, it is good for us to think about service and promotion and hiring and so forth. It's a little hard to do CVs without names in academia because publications are not anonymizable.
Yeah.
But in some other context, that's a great idea. So some of those things are great. But these are just the easy levers to push, right? And we know from a lot of the research on sexism in politics that those easy levers are only going to get part of the problem, right? As you know, as you mentioned, gender quotas really don't consistently work. They need to be taken seriously in order to work. If someone passes them into law, but then no one bothers trying to enforce them, then they don't exist, right? If they do exist, but all the women are backbenchers, then the legislature still doesn't change. And so there are informal institutions, patterns of behavior, and cultural beliefs that need to be addressed vigorously alongside any formal institutional changes. And we know from good experimental research that there are ways of presenting women that activate and don't activate stereotypes. There are ways of presenting knowledge that activate and don't activate gendered stereotypes. If we start using some of that literature in our everyday lives, as citizens first and as scholars second, I think that we have an opportunity to address some of these issues.
We have people chomping at the bit here, so let's do Melani and then
Oh,
Derek.
I just wanted to echo Jason's point about bringing in behavioral psychology. So just to give you a concrete example of this, one of the issues we discussed last year in the Standing Committee on Women around this issue of promotion was, do we put a clause on letters soliciting external promotion reviews indicating this woman had an extension on her clock for maternity leave? Because actually some institutions do this. When I've received solicitations from the UC system, I've had, for female candidates who've had extensions on their clock for maternity leave, they note this explicitly in the letter as a positive thing. So I introduced this to the committee, which is composed of like 12 different faculty members, some of whom are from the psychology department. And there was real pushback from the psychologists because they said, no, this is going to backfire. And perhaps this is a cultural context thing too, because it's going to prime people to think of women as mothers and undercut their image as professionals and as researchers. So we ended up deciding it was too risky, further research needed to be done, so we're not doing that for now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a broader societal issue. And at the end of the day, we know also in a country like Denmark, which has had gender equality policy since the late 1970s, that women on average across the whole are simply not willing to make the sacrifices. Life's all about choices, right? And sacrifices, trade-offs. That women in general are not as willing to make the sacrifice of family versus in the life-work balance that men are willing to do. The question then is why? And this is something that actually there's a great experiment going on in Scandinavia right now. So, I mean, many people would say maybe it's something fundamentally biological, right? That there are simply fundamental physical, mental differences that make you more predisposed to go one way or another. That's, of course, very controversial. There are other people who would say that a lot of this is so fundamental that we really need to rethink how we think about gender. So the Swedes are actually embarking on an experiment. One of the things, just a little thing, but one of the things they're doing is removing gender from kindergartens. There is no such thing as he and she. They conglomerate, so everybody's just a person. There's no such thing as gendered toys. And they're trying to basically introduce like a whole generation of Swedes to a non-gendered society. And that'll be really interesting to see whether actually there may be, of course, it's not a controlled experiment, but you might be able to see if we actually get women that are, there's no difference then between women that choose life and, career. Because even a very equitable society like Denmark, I know, just take my personal example. My wife is a nurse. She works 37 hours a week. I'm a professor, and I work probably 50, 60 hours. Okay, I didn't make that choice when the kids were small. I worked as much as my wife, and I did as much in the family. But at one point, there's a difference. So I mean, whether the Swedes actually succeed in breaking down all these barriers, it's going to be a fascinating experiment, but I completely agree with the cognitive stuff, and we really need to figure out what's going on.
Before we open it to questions, I had one comment about the syllabi. So this has been, I suggested when I was speaking, how difficult asking people to change their syllabi to add women is. People are extremely resistant. mostly because they know the literature. They've invested a lot of time in developing the syllabi. They're comfortable with the syllabi. It would take a lot of time to do it. It's the way they were taught. So an exchange I had, I'll just give you an example, an exchange I had with one of my colleagues, and his comment was, yes, but I'm studying such and such. My class is on such and such. I won't say what field. And all the early research in this area was all done by men. And that's true. And so my response was, then why are you organizing it chronologically? Why don't you do by theme or topic? And that way, each week you can have a more balanced discussion or a balanced group of readings. You don't have to do the development of the field chronologically. You can do it by theme and topic, which is actually probably better if you think about the way we actually do research. And I still wasn't able to break through. So people are extremely resistant, and I think in part because they have these views about the development of their fields as being a chronological and linear process, and they're not thinking in terms of themes and topics and debates as often as you would expect that they should be. So, yes. So now we'll move to questions. I have Marina, and then I'll have Ed.
So my name is Marina. I want to first to have this beautiful table discussing it. It's really nice to see this room full of people interested in that, because when I entered here at the master's studies, gender was dismissed as a control variable. And now it's so nice to see actual the part of political science discussing it. So my master's was on political participation of women and how women get to overcome the quota and etc. And as a fruit of this, me and with some other student, we created a group of studies, the group of studies of gender and politics. And we are actually planning to do a gender balancing here on the Department of Political Science, just as you showed. And my question was how we, grad students, can foster this culture on high levels and with the professors, and how can we make them buy this idea? So we showed them the data. Is that enough? How do we convince them it's important? What's your experience on that? Thank you.
So when I was in graduate school, I worked on a large survey project about the participation of underrepresented groups in cities in Latin America. And the survey, ironically, was run by a very senior woman, but she said that, one of the groups we shouldn't look at is women. And so, we tried, and we put in some gender stuff in the survey, and we kept writing papers showing, and she just didn't care. And in retrospect, okay, on the one hand, that's too bad. On the other hand, there's something that we did wrong, which was we just kind of went straight ahead, full force at this question, are they equal or not, right? And ultimately, that's not a super interesting social science way to raise the question. So a great way to make your professors interested in gender as a research question is to ask and answer questions in ways that are novel and interesting, that connect not just with gender literature, although that's obviously a key and important literature, but that raise interesting new questions for other literatures. If we had looked at how gender changes the role of labor unions, for example, in mobilizing people in the peripheries, or the way that gender changes the nature of the informal sector, I am confident that those papers would have made it into the edited volume. So finding theoretically sophisticated ways to connect gender to what your professors are interested in, then just doing it and showing it to them is, I think, almost certainly the answer.
It's kind of hard where you are. If you want to come up, you can try.
Just shout.
Do we have one that's mobile? That one's mobile? It's not that mobile. Okay, it's a little more mobile.
So my question is a very practical one, I think. Specifically, I was wondering about what are your experiences in engaging undergraduates on these issues? And the reason I ask is very much from a graduate student perspective, but I'm sure it's not just a graduate student issue, but is that just at least anecdotally, based on no research, but anecdotally, I definitely feel like I see like female graduate students are basically more likely to be reacted negatively to by undergraduates. Like I've had undergraduates complain to me about other graduate students who are female, and I can't think of a single time when that's happened with a male colleague. So I guess I'm curious about your approaches, not just on, say, with individual graduate students, but on a more systematic basis. Like, how do you engage undergraduates on these issues? Thanks.
It's not just a matter of undergraduates. You hear the comments by undergraduates about female versus male faculty. You hear it by graduate students about female versus male faculty, and you also hear it amongst your own colleagues who discuss female colleagues often in a more negative light than male colleagues. And I should point out that it's not just that men are talking like this. Women talk like this, too, about other women. So they're also more negative. And so a lot of these studies about teaching evaluations, for example, it's not just the male students that are negatively evaluating the female faculty. It's also the female students are more poorly evaluating the female faculty as well. And this really strikes at the heart of the fact that there is something that's ingrained or socialized. There's some sort of implicit bias that we haven't been able to break free from. So who can answer Ed's question? How do you deal with undergrads? How do you convince people to be fair?
You know, I'm so glad you raised this question, because when I was reading all of these pieces in these selections, almost everyone finished with a, here's what we think we can do about it. Here's some suggestions, but I might be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure the study that I cited, the experimental study, did not actually address that question. And I thought that was interesting. And then I started thinking, well, what do you do about it? And I started thinking, you know, the solution that often comes up to faculty in hiring committees is implicit bias training, is the other best practice I mentioned, and so forth. So there's a number of tools that people started to develop to deal with this issue in hiring among faculty. But, you know, what can you do with undergraduate students? And I think the options are more limited. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is, do you engage in implicit bias training with undergraduate students? That comes to mind. I don't know how it's going to work, because I don't know, maybe I'm a little, you know, jaded here. I have 2 teenagers approaching college, and I just can't imagine them being focused on this in the same way that you know, a faculty member might, and even that doesn't necessarily work at all. So I don't know, but that's one thing that comes to mind, is maybe it's part for some percentage of students. It's a simple fact of awareness and being more conscientious about that. So that might move it a little bit, but I don't know. Maybe you guys have other ideas. Looks like you have an idea.
Can I quickly say, on the implicit bias training, there's something to be careful about. There's experimental evidence that implicit bias training backfires and has the opposite effect when applied to people who have explicit bias. Yeah. And we shouldn't assume that this stuff is all implicit bias. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of people hold outright negative attitudes about minorities and women. And for those people, treating them as if they're well-intentioned, clueless liberals will not necessarily help.
Yeah.
Just a little thing. I mean, I would say living in a otherwise quite gender equal society of Denmark, and we have, I would say, predominantly undergrads, or political science undergrads are mostly women. So these are not issues that I have heard about or really ever seen. It comes much more, I think, later in the cycle, where people have to make this choice. How much do I work on my career? And I think that's when, in a society like Denmark, at least, that maybe is progressed a little bit further on certain of these questions, where it really kicks in. Because then we have things like, oh, you know, you don't want to have children, or shouldn't you be at home with your children, or all these kind of implicit, that's when those really start kicking in. So I think it really depends on the society in which it happens.
So, Ed, you want some help, though, right? So I'm going to tell you what I would do, because I have to do this all the time because I work in Mexico. So the first thing I would do is you just stop the conversation there, and you say, you need to remind these people about your female colleagues' qualifications. She was, oh, you're so, I'm listening, I hear what you're saying. You do know that she was chosen for this course because of these qualifications. And we have exactly the same problem in my class. So that promotes her and levels the situation. So that's what you can do. You have to do that. You just have to stop, and you have to promote the woman, and you have to level the playing field. Okay? I have to do that with my own colleagues. So when I teach undergrads or grad students, the very first thing I do is I always refer to my female colleagues as Dr. So-and-so. I never call them by their first name. And that is a very important signal. You have to send a signal. I walk into my class, the first day of class, I say, I'm twice as old or more than that than all of you here, and you're going to call me Professor Benton or Dr. Benton. That's it, or Doctora Profesora. And that's it. Don't call me by my first name. We're not friends. And the second thing I do is I insist that they refer to their female faculty by doctor or professora, not by their first names, no matter what the faculty member has told them in private that they can call them. In public, it's a different thing. The third thing I do is I make sure on my syllabi, when I'm teaching, for example, political economy, I include my female political economist colleagues on the syllabi. And I consistently talk about the work that's not on the syllabi. Like my student here, Daniela, is nodding. Yeah, I do that, don't I? Okay, I do that. And as the semester goes on, if I feel that people are being respectful and there's a common respect, then I sort of relax the rules a little bit about that. So you can do this thing, and this is what you have to do. You have to be really proactive about that. And you have to point it out to people when this is not egalitarian or that people aren't being treated. One of the things that we brought up at CIDE about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, I said, from the time I get to CIDE, I have a lot of people, starting with the gardeners to the administrators, through the students, through the professors, that insist upon calling me Allyson. Allyson. I am not, and I enter always with my husband, who also is a professor at CIDE, and you know what they call him? Doctor, professor. They think I'm his assistant or something. So I brought this up to the higher-ups at CIDE, insisted on it, gathered anecdotal evidence, which I shouldn't have done, but asked other women. I talked to the universe of women, actually. I talked to the women in my department, and they said, yes, the same thing happens to me. So we insisted, and there must have been some sort of message sent out, because that has changed in the last couple of years. Now when I arrive on campus, I'm not just Allyson, I'm professora or doctora. And that helps, because that kind of thing, just like syllabi, it sends a signal that we are just the same as the male faculty. Okay? So that's something you can do specifically. Patrick has some.
One footnote. That's also something that you and I can do. We're guys. There's a reservoir of authority. We can call attention to, hey, the genderedness of this, even with one's undergrads. I do this all the time. Think about why you believe this person is a credible authority and this person isn't. Maybe we should think about this in somewhat gender terms for a second. And they go, oh, well, wait, they're sort of following because, like, all right, the guy said it was supposed to do this. Wait, the guy said, ooh, they get that moment of reflexivity. It's not a formal bias training for exactly the reasons that Jason pointed out that can backfire. But it's at least that sort of moment of awareness. But, I mean, a male walking into a classroom in most contexts has a certain reservoir of authority that isn't always necessarily granted to a female colleague with exactly the same qualifications in exactly the same situation. Guys, we can use that. You can use that reservoir of authority to call attention to the gender dynamic, and then maybe suggest that people address it.
Use your power for good, not for evil. More questions? Yannicka.
I guess just like best practices for women, especially like women of color in the U.S., right? Like there's double disadvantage in the teaching. And when we talk to different elites and like professors, there's really no like TA training or instructor training for women. So like, what are you supposed to do? What are the best practices? Because we can't automatically ask for
Respect.
respect.
Please
Because,
respect me.
I mean, with my experience, it's anecdotal, but still, but I asked to be called Miss I have this, oh, she's kind of bitchy. Whereas my male colleagues, oh, he's cool. I can call him by his first name. So there's like this difference in standards as well. So we don't know really what to do.
Those of you who have TAs, would you like to take that? I too, did you have a comment about that related to Yannika's question? Oh, okay. I don't have TAs at CIDE. I have to do everything myself, so I'm going to hand it over to TA trainers.
Gosh, you know, I'm trying to think. Every time I've had TAs, they've been all of one gender. I have to think back. For some reason, it's worked out that way.
I just think it's competence. Just act as. I mean, but again, I live in a different society. So we have TAs in Introduction to International Relations, and it's typically 50-50. And we don't really see any systematic differences in the evaluations. Our women go in and kick butt. Our men go in and kick butt. We've hired them because we think they're really good, and they perform. And at the end of the day, I mean, the question is, do you do some kind of coping strategy? Do you, like a Margaret Thatcher, do you become more male than a male? And I'm not sure that that's necessarily. I think it's just competence, and just you sound like you know stuff. Maybe people will believe that. You know, don't apologize. You know stuff. You know, tell us that, and then. So I think that's just being assertive without being Margaret Thatcher.
So I guess, I mean, I do have a lot of TAs, and I've had mixed gender TA teams and so forth. One of the things that, several years ago I ran into trouble where in a methods class, a woman who was TAing for me was being disrespected by the students. And she came to me with the idea of having her give a lecture in the class and having me sit in the audience for her lecture. And apparently for her, that turned things around. And since then, especially in methods classes, because in my experience, this has been more of an issue anecdotally, but more of an issue, I early in the quarter, schedule a lecture for my women TAs to give. This might be a thing you could do, is ask the TA if you could give a guest lecture early in the quarter or semester, because that makes clear that you are there with authority and that you're in a role where the professor sees you as an emerging colleague and that you have institutional support. And I think that helps you get out of having to establish all of it yourself.
But the only risk there is, and I would say that's a great idea, but then the male colleagues should also, because then you don't want to be the token woman, right? It's there's always trade-offs with these kind of positive discrimination things that you can then be sending a signal saying, okay, the girls are out there, and then the male colleagues are just kind of there, and
you can schedule it. The women first, the men later.
Yeah. If the men want to do it, they can. What I've done, I mean, when we're talking about 18 total class sections, I don't ever say, I'm going to have the woman do this and not the man. What I do is I introduce the woman and say, this is what the research she's doing, and I'd like her to talk about this subject because it connects to what she knows. And then I don't say, and I'm not going to do this for the man, because I just don't raise the issue. And so, I mean, it is a positive discrimination of sorts, but it's one that I think isn't particularly visible unless attention is called.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we've lost power. I too, and we had a couple. Oh, okay. We're going to gather a couple questions. So I saw, okay, Kelly, and then I too. I can't hear you.
You talked a little bit about gaining like female TAs gaining credibility with graduate students. And I'm wondering a little bit about how we can have conversations with our male advisors to ensure that they are presenting us, so like in my case, me, as someone that doesn't necessarily conform to, or writing letters for me that doesn't necessarily talk about me as a woman. So I know, for example, that I have someone writing a letter of recommendation for me and saying how nice I
It talks about your intellectual capacity, and that should be the point of focus. And a concluding sentence shouldn't be, "Oh, and she's so nice." No, that's not good. Okay, we'll get to that. Aitu, you had a comment?
This might be an appropriate subject that I think should be addressed. So I was wondering how much of the league is also happening due to the sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, and like how much our discipline is suffering from that. So I think that's also an important topic to actually at least mention. So.
All right. Melanie, would you like to address Kelly's question about how to politely ask faculty to tone down the niceness?
I don't know. I have a good answer. I think, I mean, I want to applaud you for raising that issue because I think it's excellent. I'm sort of, as you were speaking, I'm sort of envisioning you, this is going to sound like awful and stereotype, but with some older male faculty member. It could happen with a female faculty member as well. I think in part, it's probably a generational thing, I'm guessing. And it might also be gendered in that it's more likely to happen with men than women, but perhaps not. And I don't know. I don't know that I can think of any other way to phrase this except to be direct. I mean, direct and polite, direct and not too pushy, but just say, here's my concerns. There's all this research, that you can cite. And you have a good start with this selection of readings that suggests that women's job hiring prospects are this or that. I mean, maybe frame it in terms of research findings. And this has come to your attention, and I'm concerned about these issues. And do you think how I'm presented in letters of recommendation and, boosting my representation as a serious scholar in light of the research findings would be an effective way to kind of overcome some of these biases, implicit or explicit. That's one way I would think. I think at some point you can't avoid being direct in a diplomatic way, but I think arming yourself with reference to research could be helpful.
Well, and you can also show them you're not so nice by being direct like that. Look, a graduate student coordinator, at some point, this needs to come up. I really do think a graduate student coordinator does bear some responsibility in making sure all the letters of recommendation being sent out, or at least are of high quality, and that meet certain standards, even if they're not all glowing, because, of course, people vary in their research. But I do think this should be something that I think that's an excellent point and should be taken up more with the grad student coordinator to make sure from a more top-down system to make sure that letters adhere to these standards, don't talk about niceness and all of that kind of thing. Talk about leadership, talk about energy, talk about things that are actually useful to people publishing.
I just had that's excellent, and we've actually had that discussion regarding the whole Me Too, and it could actually be a potential hindrance. To be honest, when I have any student, female in my office, and we're having a sensitive discussion, I close the door. But there might develop norms that say I shouldn't do that, which of course would then disadvantage the female versus the male colleagues. My PhD students, if I have to systematically treat women in a different way than I can be with a man, I can also go out, at a conference, take my PhD student with me, go for a drink, and then push them off in directions of people. It might be inappropriate. We have to be very careful about, I think, the norms that we develop regarding the whole Me Too, and of course be aware of all of these challenges and problems, but that we don't end up creating norms where it becomes so politically correct and so that we actually end up disadvantaging women in many situations. I mean, of course, the most famous is Mike Pence, who won't be in vice president, who won't be in a room together with a woman alone. That's of course crazy. But
like there's a good old saying that there's the cart before the horse, right? I mean, I think you're not wrong to talk about how we need to fix these things, and we need to think about that. But the urgent first message has to be that we have to fix these things. I don't know data on this. This is a newer topic, but I absolutely know more than one woman who's left the profession because of issues related to sexual harassment, stalking, and abuse.
Yes.
This absolutely happens in political science.
Yes.
How often, I can't say.
Well, there's an APSA study on it now.
Yeah.
I don't know
Okay.
how valid
Oh,
but
cool.
there is, right? Didn't it just come out?
Something like that. I haven't read it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
There's an ISA study as well.
Okay. On the discipline, I mean, based on a
The ISA
survey.
study is international relations.
Okay.
particularly,
Yeah.
Similar, very similar.
I can't remember the percentage, but I do seem to recall that the percentage that's reported is similar across multiple organizations and fields and disciplines. It seems to be in the 20, 30 range. I can't remember the exact number of people self-reporting instances of harassment or sexual abuse or whatever.
Which is a vastly high number,
Yes.
just to be
Yeah.
clear. That's not something we can ignore.
No.
But it's worth checking on the APSA website.
No, I don't think so.
No, I was just thinking on what Kelly was asking, and also how it is, apparently in academia, there's also like an over-appreciation of some masculine characteristics compared to more feminine characteristics or more really related to women. And I think it's not a good thing that she's nice. I think depends on the perspective of how you evaluate it. I think actually being nice can, in a class setting, be actually improve students' performance or enhance collaboration or other positive outcomes that you can that can result from this kind of interaction. But I think maybe it's also from the society we're coming from, what is value and what is not, and what are we supposed to behave as scholars in academia. I mean, I think it's an important thing that she's a competent scholar and a professional, and I think that has to be balanced in her recommendation letter. I think that's a thing that you should point out. But I think that she being nice is also an asset and should be in a way emphasized, but maybe in a more scholarly way, maybe framed in another way, but just saying also your point of view on that.
I would like to make one point that Jannika's comment raised for me. So Jannika is a woman and she's foreign in the United States and here. And I am a woman and I'm foreign in Mexico. So I don't speak Spanish the same way that I speak English, and I have to teach in Spanish, and I get tongue-tied, and I can't say things perfectly. And we're just in a harder situation. I mean, there's no real easy fix for that. My Spanish is probably not going to improve that much. I've been there 16 years. I think I've hit my plateau. So the best thing that you can do is something that Jason suggested, or I think it was Derek. You just have to be super competent. You can never walk in unprepared. You just can't wing it. And that's just the way it has to be, because you have to be prepared, you have to be ready to go, and it's through time, that hopefully people will come to respect you. I think another way that you can raise your respect as a faculty member, now you're not a faculty yet, but is also doing what Melani was talking about, is self-citations, put your stuff on the syllabus. I do that a little bit. I talk about my research in class. Even if I don't assign it, I use my research as an example to show that I do know something. And that helps a lot. Compensate for my Spanish. In Mexico, I also switch into English a little bit sometimes and scare people. So that's also helpful.
On this point, so one of my colleagues earlier this year was talking about when we evaluate graduate students and when we go through comprehensive exams with our graduate students, many of our graduate students at Northwestern are second language English speakers. And this faculty member, who is also a second language English speaker, really helpfully raised the point that writing an exam in English that isn't your first language is always going to be more difficult, and that we ought to think as a faculty differentially about second language speakers versus first language speakers in that timed context, whether that means giving more time or simply not expecting quite as much production. And that's wonderful and amazing, and my department took this on board, and it's something that's going forward. this is something that you can do not now, but as you move forward in your career, is you can raise for your colleagues the ways in which your experience creates obstacles. And so when you are talking about evaluating graduate students or tenure and promotion, you can talk about the way that teaching evaluations for people who face these kinds of double obstacles should be treated differently, because there's an inherent bias before the number even starts. And I promise you that some of your colleagues will blow it off and it will go in one ear and out the other, but others won't. And you know, that doesn't help you, but it will help the next generation, right? And that's a thing.
I just had a little comment on the niceness, actually, because there's increasing, and anytime you have a lot of competition, there's always a incentive for people just to close their door and just write, right? So they don't do their teaching well, they're not a good colleague. So I'm not necessarily sure being nice, I maybe phrase it around to being a good colleague, you're not an a-hole, would be actually kind of what you're trying to signal, right? This is not somebody, if you hire me, this is not somebody who's just going to close the door, pump out articles, and then you're going to see them again in a couple of years when they're going for tenure. So I think sometimes we also have to think about how we speak about these kinds of things, because being nice is actually, and being a good colleague is actually a wonderful thing. And it would be great if more recommendations actually had that on and said, this person is not a.
So good colleague and successful teacher rather than nice, that seems okay.
Well, yeah, synonyms. Melanie.
Yeah, I just want to call your attention to one of the pieces on this list, and Jason mentioned it, the shames and withs piece on cultures in departments and subfields. One of those, and it's based partly on a survey that was run in a department that shall remain unnamed. And there, it's really about how there are how there's different cultures and they're gendered, and women feel more comfortable or less comfortable in some seminar settings and so forth. And it cited methodology seminars, I think political economy, maybe IR, as being perceived as particularly toxic by some people in the department, and actually not exclusively by women, but more by women than men. And I think this relates at an sort of departmental level or organizational level to your point about niceness, and the other point about niceness actually being associated with higher learning outcomes. Okay, so to me, I've always been puzzled by this, having not been socialized in this environment, which I think is an import from the economics profession, and I'm not sure where it started in econ, where they got it from. But I've always been puzzled about why we should think that's actually leading to improved intellectual exchange. And it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why do we need to shoot at each other in order to advance scholarship and knowledge? I just don't get it. And I think a lot of people would benefit from a more conciliatory environment, a more constructive environment that would lead to, better learning outcomes. That's my hypothesis. I'm sure there's some research on this. But it speaks to your point at a sort of institutional or, group level rather than at the individual level.
Just one final comment, and then we'll take one more or two more questions. Just to get back to what can you do when you're in a situation like Jannika's situation or my situation? The fact is that every time you're thrown in as a TA, it's not the first time, and it's not as if there's no history to this. The more you do it, you will build up a name as being really good, and people will want to be in your class. Word does spread. You just have to count on that, and it's slow, but what was a huge handicap for me, Spanish and being a woman, arriving at CIDE when there were very few foreign faculty and also very few female faculty, over time I built up name recognition. So people now clamor to get into my classes when they have other options. Some people have to take my classes, like the graduate students, but the undergrads clamor to get with me, even though I use bad vocabulary and I say everything incorrectly, and they want to be with me. And I'm evaluated as good or better than male native Spanish-speaking TAs. So I know that I have totally overcome this just by being competent over year after year after year, and it does build up. These are not just one-off teaching responsibilities. They do build up. They do accumulate. So you do yourself good by just being prepared, going in, doing your very best, being tough on the students, and over time you will get the recognition that you deserve, and people will be more fair walking in. Additional, we have a time for one or two more questions. Anicia.
Microphone?
Yeah, you might have to come up here, Anicia, because your voice doesn't carry.
It's the air conditioning.
It's air conditioning.
Yes.
Female voices also tend not to carry as far as male voices.
It's another issue.
So sorry. I don't know if that one's working.
No?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm from a different environment. I'm an engineer, and I'm a professor in an engineering course. And there, I see this happen all the time, especially because professors are majority. Yeah, they are men, the most, in the number much higher than women. And then I have these students. We are in the class, and he said to me, "That's why I'm not hire a woman when I become engineer. You have periods, and you have babies." And I look at him. He has like 20 years old. He was, and I was 20 years old. You are thinking like that. So we are preparing this kind because this guy is going to be the CEO and the manager in many different companies. So we need to start in the undergrad studies to teach them to think differently about women.
That's explicit bias.
Yeah, implicit bias, everybody.
Flavio, you're the last one.
I have more of a comment, really. I mean, this is all really good stuff, and I think it's really, really useful to hear it. Ultimately, this seems to be, as some of you have suggested, a cultural problem. It seems to be an underlying cultural problem. And I think it's important for all of us to consider how to put all of this in practice, not just in academia, not just in our jobs, not just in our classrooms, but in life, as you're dealing with men and with women. Or with women and with men, wherever we go. Yeah.
I agree, Flavio.
Okay, but I want to say, when we say culture, let's be good social scientists and remember that culture is not a dismissive residual category. Culture includes structures, institutions, beliefs, distributions of resources. So what we're just saying is that it's a bigger and more entrenched problem. Also, it's worth noting that men and women is not like a totally exhaustive space anymore. There are other categories which make this even more complex.
All right, thank you very, very much for coming, and I really thank the participants for agreeing to be on the panel, and it was interesting for me to also hear their perspectives and advice.